Throughout history, many royal families engaged in inbreeding to secure or expand their power, but none more so than the infamous House of Habsburg. This led to one of the most inbred female lines in history, culminating in Maria Antonia of Austria, history's most inbred princess. Frail, short-lived, and the last of her line, her story is the climax of centuries of intermarriage. Alongside her deformed uncle, King Charles II, she marked the tragic end of Spain's Habsburg dynasty. But to understand how Europe's most powerful family collapsed, we must rewind through the tangled web of Habsburg history. The mighty House of Habsburg began in the rugged borderlands of Switzerland and Austria during the Middle Ages. As the years passed, the Habsburgs began to conquer much of Europe, but not primarily through bloody wars, no. Well, they had mastered the art of marriage as power, forging alliances that allowed them to seize vast empires. By the late 15th century, they inherited the Spanish throne, becoming Europe's most unstoppable force, a family whose power knew no limits. In 1556, this huge empire was split by Charles V between two branches of his family, his brother Ferdinand and his son Philip, creating two royal powerhouses, the Austrian Habsburgs, who ruled over Central Europe, and the Spanish Habsburgs, who commanded an empire stretching from Madrid to the Americas. But their strategy for keeping power in the family came at a cost. They married each other, again and again and again. This twisted tradition would lead to devastating genetic consequences, crippling their dynasty from within. There are countless figures we could begin with, and the inbreeding goes back centuries, but our story starts with Margaret of Austria, Queen of Spain, for after her, the marriages only became tighter, the genetics weaker, and the fall ever more inevitable. Margaret of Austria was born on Christmas Day 1584 in the city of Graz in the Duchy of Styria, in what is now southern Austria. Her father was Charles II, Archduke of Austria, and her mother was Maria Anna of Bavaria. Like many European royals, their bloodline was tangled with generations of cousin marriages, but this union went even further. They were uncle and niece. And yet, against the odds of such close consanguinity, 12 of their 15 children survived into adulthood. Margaret, the eighth child, was born into a crowded and ambitious household, surrounded by older siblings, already being groomed for greatness. Although Margaret hailed from the Austrian side of the family, she belonged to the Styrian branch of the Habsburgs, which was not part of the senior line. A more powerful Habsburg line governed Austria as archdukes, ruling from their stronghold in Vienna. The head of this senior line at this time was Rudolf II, an eccentric and peculiar man, more interested in employing experimental artists and magicians at his court in Vienna than ruling the Habsburg dominions. Yet his family line was thinning, and Margaret's branch carried dangerous potential, so one day they might surpass their cousins and seize control in Vienna. That possibility made young Margaret, despite coming from a so-called junior line, a critical piece on the chessboard of Habsburg power politics, as we will see. Growing up at the junior Habsburg court in Graz, she learned to speak and read Latin, the language of scholarship and Catholic worship across early modern Europe. Young court women were expected to master manners, fashion, dance, and often music. Many, like Margaret, also wrote letters in Polish, German, Latin, Italian, or English, using ornate calligraphic script. This was how Margaret spent her youth. She was also conscious of the politics of her time. The Habsburgs presided over the Holy Roman Empire, a major agglomeration of hundreds of small principalities and free cities that were only loosely tied together by loyalty to a Holy Roman Emperor, usually the senior member of the Austrian Habsburgs. For centuries, the Holy Roman Empire clung to a delicate illusion of unity, but that illusion shattered in 1517 when the Protestant Reformation ignited a firestorm of religious revolt. As Lutheran and Calvinist states broke away, centuries of imperial order began to crumble. Margaret was born into the chaos, an age of rising tensions, deepening divisions, and a fractured empire on the brink. And soon, her own life would be drawn into the storm. When she was very young, thoughts turned to Margaret's potential marriage. No concept such as being a teenager existed in early modern Europe. You went from being a child to being an adult on the onset of puberty, typically around 13 or 14, which was widely seen as the dividing line between innocence and responsibility. Therefore, it was considered perfectly normal for a daughter of a royal line to be married off as a diplomatic chess piece when she reached this age. Of course, for royal women, marriage was rarely about love, and if you were a Habsburg, it was almost certainly to a relative. To them, inbreeding wasn't taboo, it was strategy. Uniting the Austrian and Spanish branches wasn't risky, it was righteous. Power, they believed, was safest when bound by one thing: their own blood. In Margaret's case, she might normally have been married to a more minor noble. However, her cousin Emperor Rudolf II had never married, despite a string of marriage negotiations over the years, and he would most likely be succeeded by his brother Matthias, who was also childless. Because of this, the reality was that the more junior Styrian branch of the House of Habsburg was likely to succeed to become the ruling branch in Vienna one day, with Margaret's brother Ferdinand potentially becoming the Holy Roman Emperor. For this reason, Margaret's hand in marriage became an important diplomatic tool in Europe's power politics. And so, in the early months of 1599, Margaret arrived to Spain in a blaze of ceremony and expectation, destined to marry her cousin from the Spanish branch of the dynasty. This match was no scandal by the standards of the day, but still striking. Philip III, newly in his 20s, and already burdened with the weight of kingship, was wed to a girl of just 14. With this union, Margaret didn't just become Queen of Spain, she became the ceremonial Empress of a global empire. By 1599, the Spanish crown had absorbed Portugal and its overseas riches, ruling vast stretches of the Americas, the Caribbean, Africa, Asia, and the Pacific. So, when the 14-year-old Margaret wed Philip III in April 1599, she had, with one ceremony, become arguably the most powerful woman on earth. But behind the glittering facade of palaces and ceremony, what awaited her? A life of influence, or one of isolation and duty? Philip III was on paper one of the most powerful men in the world. He had just inherited the Spanish and Portuguese crowns from his formidable father, Philip II, a stern and relentless ruler who had spent decades waging wars across Europe to crush Protestantism and restore Catholic dominance. Yet in doing so, he left behind a fractured, bankrupt kingdom. It was into this uneasy inheritance that the 14-year-old Margaret arrived, but at the same time, there is no doubt that she had influence. Her husband, unlike his father, was indecisive and easily swayed, and she quickly began to exert quiet but growing influence. Her mission was clear: to bend Spanish foreign policy toward the interest of her Austrian kin. Luckily for Margaret, her marriage to Philip was close and affectionate, and it soon resulted in children. In fact, there was rarely a time when she was not pregnant for the remainder of her life. But this was no ordinary royal lineage. Both Margaret and her husband Philip III were born of uncle-niece unions, making them some of the most inbred individuals in European royal history. Their genes were tightly wound, the family tree more like a circle than a branch. Every child born to them was the result of centuries of closed bloodlines, and each pregnancy carried not just hope for the dynasty, but a risk of genetic collapse. Despite these odds, Margaret gave birth at least 8 times, and remarkably, 5 of her children lived into adulthood. For a couple with such dangerously entangled DNA, the outcome was nothing short of a miracle. Yet, even these surviving children carried the burden of their bloodline, and the genetic consequences became clearer in the next generation. On the 22nd of September 1601, Margaret gave birth to her and Philip's first child, a daughter named Anna Maria Mauricia. Like her mother before her, Anna Maria was married off young, betrothed to King Louis XIII of France at just 10 years old, and wed in 1615 at 14 years old. Anna Maria had a stillbirth, and then 4 miscarriages, before giving birth to 2 healthy boys, including Louis XIV of France, Europe's most powerful absolutist king. More children followed from Margaret and Philip's marriage. A girl, Maria, sadly died just a month after she was born in the spring of 1603. Their 2 younger children, Margaret and Alphonse Maurice, also died in either infancy or childhood, but the middle children survived. The eldest boy was named Philip after his father, and after his birth the king showered Margaret with love and attention. Born in April 1605, he would become King Philip IV of Spain one day. Another daughter, Maria Anna, born in 1606, married Ferdinand III of the Austrian Habsburgs. This was her first cousin, he being the son of Ferdinand II, Margaret's older brother. Maria Anna gave birth to 6 children, but only 3 survived into adulthood. Finally, in 1607 Margaret gave birth to a boy named Charles and another son named Ferdinand in 1609. Charles only lived to his mid-20s, but was a respected figure at the court, who was briefly considered as a potential future king when his older brother King Philip IV became severely ill at one time in the 1620s. Ferdinand, as the youngest of the surviving sons, entered the church and became a cardinal, encouraged by his mother in his religion during his earliest years, whose Roman Catholic piety was well known. He also had a political career by serving as governor of the Spanish Netherlands in what is now Belgium for a time. Philip III was far from the most decisive of monarchs. He was notoriously impressionable, easily swayed by courtiers and even his strong-willed wife. This was significant. Spain still sat atop a vast, wealthy empire, yet decades of disastrous wars against the French, Dutch, English and Turks had drained its coffers dry. In Madrid, a desperate circle of reformers now rose, demanding bold action to save what remained of Spain's fading glory. Margaret was not a good influence in this regard. Deeply conservative, she fiercely opposed any proposals to cut spending on the church and royal ceremony. The result was catastrophic. Spain's economic situation continued to decline, with the government going bankrupt multiple times over in the course of Philip III's reign, just as it had under his father. At the heart of the Spanish court, a fierce power struggle erupted. A faction of courtiers rose in open opposition to Margaret, accusing her fanatical Catholic zeal of warping the king's judgment and dragging the empire into chaos. She clashed repeatedly with the Duke of Lerma, Spain's most powerful noble, and the true ruler behind Philip III's feeble throne. He begrudgingly respected her cunning and sharp political instincts, but there is also no doubt that he also deemed her to be a serious problem and tried to shut her out of power. For her part, Margaret formed an alliance with several other female members of the court. Though barred from official roles, they subtly shaped politics through personal connections, strategic counsel, and quiet persuasion, exercising real power from the shadows of the royal household. Margaret's allies included Dowager Empress Maria, widow of Emperor Maximilian II, who wielded influence at the Spanish court until her death in 1603. More enduring, however, was Margaret's alliance with Maria's daughter, Margaret of the Cross, a royal nun known for her piety and courtly connections. Together, the three Austrian Habsburg women steered Philip III toward a fiercely pro-Austrian, pro-Catholic policy. So, when Margaret's brother Ferdinand II faced a Protestant revolt in Bohemia in 1618, sparking the 30 Years' War, Spain swiftly backed Austria. Their shared goal was simple: to restore Catholic rule and Habsburg supremacy across the fractured Holy Roman Empire. It was a fateful decision that would bleed Spain dry. The war dragged on for decades, and by the time Margaret's son King Philip IV died in 1665, Spain was a ghost of its former glory, completely overshadowed by England, France and others. And the tragic cost of that downfall would be borne by the next Habsburg king. Ultimately, while Margaret succeeded in imposing a pro-Austrian policy on her weak-willed husband and outflanked the Duke of Lerma in this regard, she would never live to see the fruits of that same policy realized. She died on the 3rd of October 1611 from complications brought about by childbirth after giving birth to her son, Alphonse Maurice, who himself would die before his first birthday. She was just 26 years of age at the time. King Philip was devastated by her death and never remarried, despite being only 33. He died 10 years later. Despite her short life, Margaret succeeded in shaping court politics and for now had secured the dynasty's succession. Nevertheless, as the 17th century wore on, the Habsburgs doubled down on their deadly incestuous tradition, with uncle marrying niece, generation after generation, in a desperate bid to keep power pure. But the cost was catastrophic. Maria Anna of Spain was born at the Escorial Palace north of Madrid in Spain on the 18th of August 1606. Her father was King Philip III of Spain, the powerful monarch who ruled the vast Iberian Empire from 1598. At the time, Spain was considered the preeminent power in Europe, one which ruled over large parts of Italy and the Low Countries, and had an extensive colonial empire across the Americas, the Caribbean, and even in the Philippines. The Spanish court was consequently a place of vast riches, and young Maria Anna was raised in luxury, unimaginable splendor, but also suffocating royal duty. Maria Anna's mother was Margaret of Austria, her father's first cousin once removed, a match that was hardly unusual in the dangerously tangled family tree of the Habsburg dynasty. By the time Maria Anna was born, centuries of obsessive inbreeding had turned the Habsburg bloodline into a genetic time bomb, riddled with overlapping ancestries and devastating health risks. On her father's side, she descended from King Philip II of Spain and his niece, Archduchess Anna of Austria, and on her mother's side, another Habsburg uncle-niece pairing, Charles II of Inner Austria and Maria Anna of Bavaria. Maria Anna was related to herself through multiple branches of the same twisted family tree, yet, remarkably, she showed none of the infamous Habsburg deformities or afflictions, at least not outwardly. The worst was yet to come though, and future generations wouldn't have the same luck. Maria Anna was the fourth of her parents' children. An older sister Anna would go on to become Queen of France, while her older brother would become King Philip IV of Spain in 1621. This came after their father died prematurely at 42 years of age, after contracting a disease that remains uncertain to this day, though typhus or influenza are among the suspected causes. By the time her father died, the issue of who Maria Anna would marry had been debated at the Spanish court for several years. With King Philip III gone, her brother, the newly crowned Philip IV, seized control of her fate. All eyes turned to one controversial high-stakes plan, the so-called Spanish match, a proposed marriage that would ignite fierce diplomatic battles, stir national outrage, and nearly unite two of Europe's greatest powers. The subject of Maria Anna's potential marriage turned into a major diplomatic affair in the politics of Europe in the 1620s. When she was still a child, there had been a plan to marry her to her cousin, Archduke John Charles, a son of Ferdinand II, the future Holy Roman Emperor. But this fell through when John Charles died in 1618. At the time, Spain and France were locked in yet another clash for dominance, and it was now that a shocking proposal emerged: an alliance with England. Maria Anna was now planned to marry none other than Charles, Prince of Wales, the heir to the thrones of England, Scotland and Ireland. It was a bold, almost unthinkable move, uniting two historic rivals through marriage. Yet, in the ruthless game of European power politics, nothing was off the table. Thus began the infamous negotiations over the Spanish match, a royal gamble that would send shockwaves through courts and kingdoms alike. These negotiations began in 1621 following the death of Philip III and the accession of Maria Anna's brother as King Philip IV. New councillors now ran the government in Madrid, and they advised that the marriage alliance with England should be promoted. The talks dragged on for years, culminating in 1623 in a bizarre incident where Prince Charles and the Duke of Buckingham travelled to Spain in disguise to further the negotiations. When they arrived at the Spanish court and revealed themselves, things seemed to go well at first, but then the talks broke down. Charles considered he had been treated poorly and left for England. When he returned, he brought back more than disappointment. He brought a diplomatic disaster. The marriage plans didn't just collapse, they imploded, triggering outrage, scandal, and a chain reaction that led to all-out war. By 1625, the Anglo-Spanish War had begun, and it would drag on for 5 bloody years. King Philip now needed to find a new husband for his little sister, and he would find the perfect match within his own family. With the collapse of negotiations over the Spanish match and the descent into war, the Spanish government now returned to the idea of marrying Maria Anna to one of her many cousins. And so it was that in 1626, Maria Anna was betrothed to her cousin, Archduke Ferdinand of Austria, the son and heir of Emperor Ferdinand II. He was also the younger brother of Archduke John Charles, who had once been proposed as a husband for Maria Anna before his untimely death years earlier. The marriage negotiations dragged on for 2 years as points of conflict concerning the dowry and the succession rights in Spain continued. In the end, it was only late in 1629 that Maria Anna and her entourage finally left the Spanish court and set out for Vienna. The journey took well over a year, largely delayed by a devastating outbreak of the bubonic plague in Italy, one of the worst the region had seen in early modern history. Before the wedding could take place, though, Ferdinand, wary of the idealized portraits he'd received, decided to see his bride in secret. Only after this private inspection did he agree to proceed with the marriage. Finally, on February 20, 1631, Maria Anna married the future Emperor Ferdinand III in Vienna. At 24 years old, she was considered a fairly old royal bride, but she was close in age to her new husband, who was just a year younger at 23 years old. Despite the political nature of the match, the marriage proved to be surprisingly warm and affectionate. Ferdinand was deeply devoted to his wife and remained faithful throughout their union, a rarity among royals of the era. Maria Anna's cheerful and lively nature balanced Ferdinand's more solemn personality, bringing light to an otherwise serious court. But their marriage unfolded against a grim backdrop: the brutal and unrelenting 30 Years' War, which ravaged across Europe and left devastation in its wake. In order to understand how Maria Anna's life was lived in Central Europe after her marriage to Ferdinand, we need to look at the conflict that was ravaging there in the first half of the 17th century. Germany had been divided over religion ever since the Protestant Reformation began in 1517. There had been intermittent wars between Catholics and Protestants amongst the dozens of major German states throughout the 16th century. These had boiled over again in 1618 after the Protestants of Bohemia, a kingdom corresponding to modern-day Czechia, which the Habsburgs ruled, had tried to resist efforts to reimpose Catholicism in Prague and other places. The Bohemian War expanded into the 30 Years' War in 1618 and 1619 as more and more German states joined the conflict. Even as Maria Anna was at the centre of negotiations with England over the Spanish match in the first half of the 1620s, the Habsburgs had won victory after victory and were looking like achieving their goal of imposing their authority over all of Germany. But then, in order to avoid a Habsburg victory, other major Protestant powers began intervening in the conflict. The Kingdom of Denmark got involved in 1625, followed by the Swedish intervention in 1629. As these Protestant powers intervened, their armies pushed the Habsburgs southwards from Germany back towards Austria and Bohemia. Entire cities were reduced to rubble, and once secure lands collapsed in days. The war was closing in, and soon it would reach even the royal Habsburg family. By the time Maria Anna arrived in Austria, the war had already claimed the lives of several 100,000 men. But the worst impact was felt by the civilian population. As farms were burned out and entire towns and cities were destroyed, everyday life was disrupted, and famine developed in some places. It is estimated that anywhere between 4 and 10 million people died before the war ended, making this the most destructive war in the history of early modern Europe. Even within the gilded walls of the Habsburg palaces, Maria Anna couldn't ignore the suffering outside. The empire her new family ruled was being torn apart, and the horrors of war crept ever closer, all while her husband, deeply involved in the conflict, was often away at the front. This wouldn't just haunt the world around her, it would come to define her entire life. From the moment she married, Maria Anna became queen consort of both Hungary and Bohemia, but her rise didn't stop there. In 1637, following the death of her father-in-law, her husband was elected Holy Roman Emperor, and Maria Anna ascended as Holy Roman Empress at one of the most critical moments in European history. Despite the fact that the French were broadly Catholics, they intervened in the war directly from 1635 onwards to keep the Protestant German states alive in order to reduce the power of the Habsburgs. As this happened, the Austrian Habsburgs needed the help of their Spanish cousins more than ever. Maria Anna was a vital point of contact between the Austrian and Spanish governments, writing regularly to her brother, King Philip IV of Spain. She urged him to continue the war against the French and their allies, and continue aiding the Austrian side of the family. With her husband frequently away, leading military campaigns across Germany, Maria Anna became a central figure in the Austrian court. Rather than relying on male ministers, Ferdinand entrusted her with real power, appointing her as regent on multiple occasions, a rare honour that spoke volumes about his trust in her judgment and political skill. But while she ruled in his absence, another royal duty loomed, one far more personal, far more perilous, and one that would end in heartbreak. Maria Anna was regularly pregnant after she married Ferdinand. Royal women were expected to try and have as many children as possible in late medieval and early modern times. 1 in 3 children died in infancy, and others were claimed as they grew older by diseases like measles and smallpox. The best way to secure the royal line was therefore to have as many children as possible, and preferably multiple sons. The eventual heir to Ferdinand III was actually born within 2 years of his and Maria Anna's marriage. This was the future Ferdinand IV, born in September 1633. Maria Anna's second child, a daughter named Mariana after her mother, was born in December 1634, just 15.5 months after Ferdinand. A second son, Philip Augustus, was born in 1637, but he died before reaching his second birthday. A third son, Maximilian, did not even reach his first birthday. Finally though, a healthy second heir was born in 1640. This child, named Leopold, would eventually succeed to the Habsburg domains in the late 1650s and would go on to become one of the longest reigning and most successful Habsburg rulers in the family's nearly 900-year-long history. As the 1640s went on, Maria Anna and Ferdinand most likely believed that Leopold would be their last child. Maria Anna, after all, was nearing her 40th year by the mid-1640s. So, when Maria Anna unexpectedly fell pregnant again in late 1645, it came as a shock, a final unexpected twist in an already turbulent life. But this sixth and final pregnancy would not bring celebration. Maria Anna's final pregnancy would end in tragedy, in part because of the disordered state of Austria in 1646. The Swedish had gained the upper hand in the 30 Years' War with French aid, and in the mid-1640s were advancing southwards into Bohemia and Austria. Maria Anna and her family were at a royal residence at Linz when they received word of the rapid advance of the enemy into lands which were previously considered beyond the reach of the Swedish and their French and German allies. In a state of panic, the royal family fled to Vienna as enemy forces closed in. The pressure was immense, the court was in turmoil, the empire was crumbling at the edges, and Prague would eventually fall to the advancing Swedish army before the war's end. Amid this chaos and fear, Maria Anna became pregnant with her sixth child. Then the unthinkable happened. The plague arrived to Vienna. The safest way to avoid the plague in those days was simply to escape from whatever city it arrived to and take up residence in a country house away from other people. Maria Anna and her children consequently headed back to Linz, despite the dangerous military situation. Shortly after arriving there, she became ill. Her situation deteriorated over the next weeks that followed, and on the 12th of May 1646, she began to bleed heavily. The doctors realized that the best chance of the child surviving was to cut it out of her, a dreadful practice which was all too common in the early modern world. And so, Maria Anna died from blood loss early on the 13th of May 1646, aged 39. The child lived for only a few hours, and they were buried together in the Habsburg Imperial Crypt in Vienna. The 30 Years' War went on for 2 more years. Even when Maria Anna died in 1646, peace negotiations were well underway at Westphalia and Osnabrück in the northwest of Germany. The Habsburgs had to accept defeat, and a principle was established that European states could no longer intervene in the affairs of other countries and principalities when it came to their religious affairs. Despite their love, Maria Anna's husband would marry twice more, but it was the sons and daughters which he and Maria Anna had that would go on to rule in Austria and to produce the future kings of Spain. Maria Anna was born on Christmas Eve 1634 in Weimar Neustadt, just south of Vienna. Her father was Archduke Ferdinand of Austria, the son of Ferdinand II, the Holy Roman Emperor, and one of the most powerful figures in Central Europe. Maria Anna's father was also the King of Hungary and Croatia, as part of the many titles which the Austrian Habsburgs had in the 17th century. Just 3 years after Maria Anna's birth, her father would inherit the imperial throne. This meant that any children of Ferdinand's would become important pieces in the marriage alliances which all of Europe's royal families engaged in at the time. Her mother, Maria Anna of Spain, was the daughter of King Philip III of Spain, making Maria Anna the product of 2 of Europe's most dominant royal families. But their union was more than just a strategic marriage. It was a marriage of blood. Maria Anna's parents were closely related cousins, part of the Habsburg dynasty's obsessive practice of inbreeding to keep power within the family. This relentless intermarriage would shape Maria Anna's destiny in ways no one could predict. As we will soon see, the cost of this royal tradition would be far greater than anyone could have imagined, leading to shocking and devastating consequences for Maria Anna's life. Maria Anna grew up and was educated in Austria during a time of war. Her father was deeply involved in a brutal conflict that had raged since 1618, the infamous 30 Years' War, and he was determined to bring it to an end. By 1645, as peace negotiations gained momentum, attention shifted to Maria Anna's future. More specifically, to her marriage, a crucial piece in the grand chessboard of Habsburg alliances. The plan was clear. She would marry a Spanish prince. The man in question was Balthasar Charles, Prince of Asturias and Girona. He was the only son of King Philip IV of Spain from his first marriage to Elizabeth of France, who had died in 1644. But there was one glaring issue. Balthasar Charles was Maria Anna's first cousin, the son of her mother's brother. Still, for the Habsburgs, such close blood ties were hardly a problem. By 1646, an agreement was reached. Once Maria Anna came of age in a couple of years, she would marry Balthasar, who was 5 years older. Then, fate intervened. In October 1646, just weeks after their betrothal, Balthasar Charles fell ill. He died soon after, possibly from smallpox, just days before his 17th birthday. The engagement was shattered, and Spain was suddenly left without an heir. This created a crisis for Philip IV. A widower with no male successor, he faced immense pressure to secure the dynasty. His solution? A shocking proposal. Since Balthasar could no longer marry Maria Anna, Philip would marry her himself. Incredibly, the arrangement was agreed to. The wedding had to be delayed due to Maria Anna's young age, but on October 7, 1649, she married her uncle in a church outside Madrid. She was just 14 years old. He was 44. Maria Anna did her best to adjust to life in Madrid. At just 14 years old, she was now queen consort of the largest empire on earth. Spain's dominion stretched across the Americas, the Philippines, and vast territories beyond, making it a true global superpower. Her husband, Philip IV, was known at court as Rey Planeta, the Planet King, a grand title symbolizing his empire's reach across the world. Thrust into the heart of Spanish royalty at such a young age, Maria Anna had no choice but to adapt quickly. She mastered Spanish, navigated the complex court politics, and prepared herself for a far greater role. Though she was Philip's wife, she would eventually become the real power behind the throne. Maria Anna and Philip's marriage soon resulted in children. Their first child, Margaret Theresa, was born in 1651, and her fate mirrored her mother's in an eerie act of dynastic repetition. Tragedy then struck as two of her children, Maria Ambrosia and Ferdinand Thomas, died in infancy. Maria Anna and Philip had two other sons, Philip Prospero, born in 1657, and Charles or Carlos, born in 1661. But misfortune struck again. Philip Prospero died in 1661, leaving only Charles as the last hope for the Spanish throne. Then in 1665, Maria Anna's world changed forever. Philip IV, her husband and uncle, died, leaving behind a broken empire and a fragile heir. Charles, just shy of his 4th birthday, became king. But Spain's future was anything but secure, and Maria Anna was about to take centre stage in one of the most turbulent periods of its history. It was clear from the start that Carlos, better known to history as King Charles II of Spain, would not be able to rule on his own for many years. At just 4 years old, he was far too young to govern, and even when he came of age, his court would be dominated by powerful nobles well into his late teens. With Spain in desperate need of leadership, a swift decision was made. Maria Anna would serve as regent during her son's minority. In essence, she became the de facto ruler of Spain, the substitute monarch until Charles could take the throne in his own right. But ruling Spain as a female regent, in one of the most deeply patriarchal courts in Europe, was no easy task. Though she held the title of regent, Her authority was constantly challenged by senior Spanish nobles, who wielded immense influence in the years that followed. Maria Anna faced an immense challenge as regent. Spain had once been the world's greatest superpower, its empire expanding across the Americas, fueled by the seemingly endless gold and silver from the mines of Mexico, Peru and Bolivia. But by the 17th century, those riches were running dry, and Spain's political stagnation, economic troubles and domestic unrest were becoming impossible to ignore. Now, it fell to Maria Anna to reverse Spain's decline, all while managing constant wars that drained resources and morale. One of the longest running conflicts was the war with Portugal, which had been under Spanish rule since 1580, but had rebelled in 1640. By the time Maria Anna took power, it was clear the war was unwinnable, especially since France and England were backing the Portuguese. Influenced by her Jesuit advisor, Cardinal Juan Everardo Nithard, Maria Anna made a bold decision. Spain would cut its losses. In 1668, she signed both the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle and the Treaty of Lisbon, ending the war with France and Portugal, and officially recognizing Portugal's independence. But Spain's troubles were far from over. Just 4 years later, war broke out again, this time with France. The reason? Spain still controlled the Spanish Netherlands, modern-day Belgium and Luxembourg, and King Louis XIV of France was determined to seize it for himself. Thus, the struggle for Spain's survival was far from over. As dire as Spain's international struggles were, they were nothing compared to the crisis unfolding at home. As he grew up, it was clear that King Charles II, Maria Anna's only surviving son, was not well. Historians and medical experts still debate what exactly afflicted Charles, but the records paint a grim picture. His body never fully developed. He could barely walk unaided, had such an extreme Habsburg jaw that he struggled to chew food properly, and his mental faculties were severely impaired. He aged prematurely, showing dementia-like symptoms in his 20s, and even started going bald around this time. To his contemporaries, he was known as El Rey Hechizado, the Bewitched King, as many believed his countless physical and intellectual issues were the result of sorcery. But the real cause for concern was more sinister. Charles's condition was likely the result of severe inbreeding, which had weakened the Habsburg bloodline over generations. He likely suffered from a combination of genetic disorders, including hormonal deficiencies, epilepsy, skeletal deformities, and more. This was no coincidence. Maria Anna had married her own uncle, and both came from a dynasty that had intermarried for centuries. Charles's inbreeding coefficient, a measure of how genetically similar one's parents are, was shockingly high. In fact, some estimates suggest that his genetic makeup was as inbred of that of a child born to siblings. Other theories put forward by modern researchers as the cause of his condition include one or more autosomal recessive disorders and a herpetic infection incurred as an infant, causing hydrocephalus, which is an excessive accumulation of cerebral spinal fluid in the brain. By the 1670s, it became undeniable. Charles would never be able to fully rule Spain by himself. Already struggling on the world stage, Spain now faced an even greater nightmare, an empire ruled by a king who could barely function. Charles was deemed to have come of age in 1675 when he turned 14 years old, and his mother's long 10-year spell as regent came to an end. However, court factional fighting and Charles's clear inability to rule for himself saw Maria Anna orchestrate an arrangement whereby the regency was re-established in 1677. Maria Anna's return to power was short-lived though. She was outmaneuvered when John Joseph of Austria, the illegitimate son of the late King Philip IV, and thus Charles II's half-brother, seized control of the regency. Yet, he only held power for 2 years before his death in 1679. With John's death, she reclaimed the regency, once again becoming the most powerful figure in Spain. This time, she would hold on to power for the rest of her life. One of Maria Anna's greatest concerns during the Second Regency was securing the future of the Spanish monarchy. Charles II was physically and mentally unfit to rule, but perhaps he could father an heir who might restore the dynasty. Determined to ensure this, she arranged for her son to marry Marie-Louise d'Orléans, the niece of King Louis XIV of France, in 1679. The marriage was miserable for Marie-Louise, and worse still, it produced no children. After years of suffering in a foreign court, she died in 1689, likely from a burst appendix, though some whispered rumours of poison. Determined to secure an heir, Maria Anna arranged for Charles to remarry within months. His second wife, Maria Anna of Neuburg, was the daughter of a German noble, chosen for her family's reputation for fertility, while her parents had 17 children. But it was all in vain. Charles remained without an heir. These years were very difficult for Maria Anna. She was constantly anxious about Spain's decline, her son's condition, the Habsburg dynasty, and frequently argued with her daughter-in-law. By the early 1690s, it was painfully clear that Charles would never produce a child. His health worsened rapidly, and many at court believed his death was imminent. Maria Anna, however, would not live to see his final days. In the mid-1690s, she developed what appears to have been breast cancer. After years of political struggle and failed efforts to secure Spain's future, she died in Madrid on May 16, 1696, at the age of 61. Infanta Margarita Teresa, or Margaret Teresa in English, was born in the Royal Alcazar Palace in Madrid on the 12th of July 1651. Her father was King Philip IV. He had been the ruler of Spain since 1621, after ascending to the throne when he was just 15 years old. Margaret's mother was Mariana or Maria Anna of Austria, a daughter of Ferdinand III, Duke of Austria, and Holy Roman Emperor. Margaret Teresa's parents weren't just distant relatives. They were far closer than anyone should be. Her father was from the Spanish branch of the family, her mother from the Austrian side, but their connection ran much deeper. Because, in a shocking display of royal inbreeding, they were uncle and niece. The disturbingly close blood ties between Margaret's parents came at a cost. Of their 5 children, 3 died in infancy. Only 2 survived. Margaret and her younger brother Carlos, known as Charles in English. But survival didn't mean salvation. Charles was a walking testament to the horrors of inbreeding. In fact, Margaret and Charles's inbreeding coefficient was grotesquely high, with some estimates suggesting they were as inbred as children born to siblings. Margaret may have been luckier, but she wasn't completely unaffected. Though much healthier than her brother, she carried the Habsburg curse in her own way, as we will see. Margaret was raised in the grandeur of the Royal Alcazar Palace, a world of opulence where every whim was catered to by an army of maids and servants. For example, the Infanta frequently indulged in sweets and chocolates, which she had to hide from the court physicians. Yet, beneath the luxury lay the suffocating constraints of the Madrid court, where every movement, every word, every glance was dictated by unyielding royal etiquette. As a princess of the mighty Habsburg dynasty, she received the finest education money and power could provide. She was taught multiple languages, versing herself in German to better converse with her Habsburg cousins from the Austrian side of the family, and learned some Latin, the sacred language of scholarship and the Roman Catholic Church. But no education could prepare her for the fate that awaited her. As Margaret grew older, she couldn't ignore the glaring age gap between her parents, while her father was nearly 30 years older than her mother. But if that detail disturbed her, she never showed it. Age differences aside, her parents adored her. She was their prized jewel, the only truly healthy child their union had produced, and they showered her with affection. With her delicate features and lively spirit, Margaret captivated those around her. She was their little angel, a nickname whispered with adoration by family and friends alike. Perhaps that's why her parents commissioned one of Europe's greatest painters to immortalize her in a stunning portrait when she was just 5 years old. A portrait that would become one of the most famous paintings in history. Velázquez's painting was once known as La Familia, the family. Today it is called Las Meninas, which means the ladies in waiting. This is a more appropriate title as it depicts Margaret being waited on by several household staff who are fixing her dress. Among the many figures captured in the painting, another stands out, Marie Barbola, a courtier with dwarfism. In an era when those with her condition were often reduced to mere entertainment for the nobility, Velázquez did something radical. Instead of simply portraying her as a joke, he gave her depth, dignity, and a piercing gaze that suggests a complex inner world. Even Velázquez himself appears in the masterpiece, a silent observer of the lavish yet rigid world of the Spanish court. Other people are seen in paintings and mirrors in Las Meninas, including Margaret's parents. And this wasn't the only famous painting of Margaret either. Velázquez painted no less than 5 portraits of the princess in her youth, immortalizing her prettiness and royal elegance. In fact, she was one of the most painted young people in all of early modern Europe, crafting her image of power and prestige, though this would contrast with the sad destiny that awaited her. It might seem hard to fathom to modern minds, but by the time Las Meninas was painted in 1656, when Margaret was just 5 years old, there was already a growing discussion at the Spanish court about who she would marry. In the ruthless world of royal politics, marriage was never about love, it was about power. Emotions and personal desires meant nothing when dynasties were at stake. As the daughter of the King of Spain, Margaret wasn't just a princess, she was a high-stakes chess piece in the brutal game of European diplomacy, her future decided long before she even understood it. For instance, at one point there was a suggestion that she could marry Charles Stuart of the English royal family. He was restored to the English throne as King Charles II of England, Scotland and Ireland in 1660, after England had briefly experimented with being a republic in the 1650s. A marriage of this kind would have been used to form an unlikely alliance with the English, at a time when France and Spain were bitter rivals for dominance of Western Europe. In the end, Charles instead married Catherine of Braganza, a Portuguese bride, in 1662. The collapse of negotiations for Margaret to marry Charles Stuart was primarily owing to King Philip's opposition. Instead, he believed that his daughter should marry a member of the Austrian side of the Habsburg family. He seemed to show no concern whatsoever that this marriage would deepen the family's inbreeding. After all, it was simply how the Habsburgs kept power in their grip. As for Margaret, she had no say in her fate. When negotiations between Madrid and Vienna began, she was likely blissfully unaware of the shocking consequences this union would bring. She was still just 11 years old when it was announced at the royal court that she would marry Leopold of the House of Habsburg. Like her mother before her, Margaret was now destined to continue the incestuous Habsburg tradition and was going to marry a very close family member, a man who was both her first cousin and her uncle. Leopold was her mother's younger brother and had succeeded to become Archduke of Austria, King of Hungary, Croatia and Bohemia, and the Holy Roman Emperor in quick succession in the late 1650s. Even in early modern Europe, there were some standards around when a child was old enough to marry. Margaret was betrothed to her uncle early in 1663, but she was deemed to be too young for the marriage to take place at that time. Instead, it was not until April 1666, by which time she was nearing her 15th birthday, that Margaret set off from Madrid to travel to Vienna. A 6-month tour followed, and the Spanish royal party only arrived in Vienna in December 1666. The marriage ceremony took place a few days later, on the 12th of December. It was a magnificent event, attended by many of Europe's most powerful royals and dignitaries, with no expense spared. And the grandeur didn't end there. Celebrations raged on throughout 1667. Yet, behind the splendour, a dark fate was already unfolding. Life in Vienna was peculiar and sometimes difficult for Margaret. To begin with, she and her new husband had a strange marriage. It might surprise modern ears to hear this, but they didn't try to ignore their close blood relationship. She actually called him uncle. Despite this unorthodox situation, they did get along. They enjoyed some of the same pursuits, including art and music, and Leopold did his best to make sure Margaret was comfortable in her new surroundings. It was also common for royals like Margaret, when they left their homeland to go and marry a foreign ruler or prince, to bring along members of their old household staff. So she would have had some familiar faces around her at the court in Vienna, as she acclimatized to her new life. Perhaps there were even some of the people who had been there in Madrid when Velázquez was painting Las Meninas many years earlier. Despite this, Margaret remained deeply homesick, clinging to her Spanish roots and doing little to improve her German. As time passed, her once delicate beauty began to fade, her complexion grew paler, her features more fatigued, and the characteristic Habsburg jaw became more pronounced. The marriage was troubled in other ways too. Margaret became pregnant almost immediately after arriving in Vienna, and gave birth to a boy named Ferdinand in September 1667. He only survived for 3.5 months though, and died in January 1668. Their luck seemed to change with the birth of their next child, a daughter, Maria Antonia, born in January 1669. She would be the only one of Margaret's children to survive. 2 others were not so fortunate. A son, John Leopold, was born on the 20th of February 1670, but tragically died within hours. Another daughter, Maria Anna, lived just 2 weeks before passing away in February 1672. And this devastating pattern was a sign of things to come. Margaret's difficult series of pregnancies were partly owing to her own health problems. Although she had been a much healthier child than her brother, she did have some growing health issues in the years leading up to and following her arrival in Vienna. When she arrived to the Austrian capital late in 1666, people there quickly began commenting on her frequent illnesses. For a time, many observers put this down to the constant strain of pregnancy. In just 6 years, she endured 6 pregnancies, including 4 live births and 2 miscarriages, each leaving her weaker and more depressed than before. But as time passed, it became clear that something more sinister was at play. Margaret was often confined to her bed, even when she wasn't pregnant. Physicians diagnosed her with an enlarged thyroid gland, but in the 17th century, there was no cure, and her condition only worsened. Things really went downhill for Margaret in the early spring of 1673. She had a 3-week-long attack of stomach pains. Then she developed a fever. There are documents that were written by foreign ambassadors at the court at Vienna at this time, which indicate that many were seriously concerned that she would die. By early March, she had difficulties breathing, and on the 10th of March a confessor was called in to hear her last confession and give her the sacrament. Just 2 days later, on March 12th, Margaret died at the tender age of 21. An autopsy revealed a heartbreaking truth. She was carrying another baby boy at the time of her death. Her life, cut tragically short, ended in the imperial crypt in Vienna, where she was laid to rest. The death of the Archduchess and Holy Roman Empress resulted in a lengthy mourning period at the Austrian court. The funeral services stretched on for weeks into April. Leopold was devastated by his wife's untimely death. However, this didn't stop him marrying again by the end of the year. His new wife was Archduchess Claudia Felicitas of Austria, a member of the Tyrolese branch of the Habsburgs. But for Leopold, the marriage wasn't about love, it was about survival. The dynastic game had to continue, and more heirs were desperately needed, preferably male, to ensure the Habsburgs' reign could endure. After Margaret's death, her rights to the Spanish throne were passed to her only surviving daughter, Maria Antonia. Maria Antonia of Austria was born on the 18th of January 1669 in the Hofburg Palace in Vienna, the capital of Austria. Her father was Leopold I, a very powerful man. He was Holy Roman Emperor, King of Hungary, Croatia, and Bohemia. Her mother was Margaret Theresa of Spain, a daughter of King Philip IV of Spain, and Mariana of Austria. As I've mentioned throughout, the Habsburgs liked to keep it in the family. Second cousins, first cousins, even uncles and nieces. And these centuries of relentless inbreeding culminated in Maria Antonia. She wasn't just the product of one unfortunate match. She was the result of generation after generation of uncle-niece marriages, compounding the dynasty's genetic decay. Of course, her parents were uncle and niece too. All of this meant that Maria Antonia was the most inbred Habsburg of all time, surpassing even her infamous uncle, Charles II of Spain. She had such a high inbreeding coefficient that she was more inbred than a child born from a parent-offspring or brother-sister union. So, what did this mean for Maria Antonia? Would she suffer the same tragic fate as Charles II, or had she somehow escaped the curse of her family's obsession? Miraculously, Maria Antonia was born healthy and was a relatively normal child, defying expectations given her extreme inbreeding. But she was the exception, not the rule. As the second child of her parents' deeply incestuous marriage, she was the only one to survive past infancy, likely a result of the centuries of inbreeding that had weakened her bloodline. Her parents' first child was a boy named Ferdinand, who died a year before Maria Antonia was born. Two other children, John and Maria Anna, were born in 1670 and 1672. Sadly, they both passed away as well within hours or days of being born. Then, to make matters worse, her mother, Margaret Theresa, a frail and sickly woman, died in March 1673 at just 21 years old. The years of inbreeding had taken their toll, and like so many Habsburgs before her, she was physically weak and plagued by poor health. Maria Antonia was left motherless at just 4 years old, and as the only surviving child of her parents' deeply inbred union, she was suddenly thrust into a precarious position. She was a potential heir to the Archduchy of Austria, but only until her father remarried and produced a male heir. Austria had never had a female ruler, and no one was even sure if the law would allow it. If Leopold died unexpectedly, would the nobles accept a female ruler, or would Austria plunge into chaos? And Maria Antonia wasn't just a possible heir to Austria, she also had a strong claim as successor to the Spanish throne, placing her at the centre of one of the most powerful and unstable dynasties in Europe. Maria Antonia might have been the most inbred Habsburg of all time, but it was her uncle Carlos, known as Charles II of Spain, who had suffered most from it. As mentioned before, Charles inherited the Spanish throne in 1665, just before his 4th birthday. He would never be able to rule by himself though, and constantly needed advisors and proxies who ruled on his behalf. As a result, there was constant talk of the succession in the courts of Europe. With her mother's death in March 1673, Maria Antonia became the legitimate heir to her uncle, King Charles II of Spain. Though just 11 years old at the time, Charles's frail health and severe disabilities left many to wonder if he could even father a child. This made Maria Antonia the presumed future Queen of Spain, destined to inherit not just the Spanish throne, but its vast empire stretching across Europe, the Americas and beyond. And, given Charles's deteriorating condition, that day could come much sooner than anyone expected. As a result of all of this, Maria Antonia lived her life under a microscope. Diplomats scrutinized her actions when they visited the court at Vienna, and her father sought to promote the idea that she would one day succeed Charles. This resulted in a lot of Habsburg propaganda. Maria Antonia sat for numerous portraits in her youth, a common practice for royals. Her father used these paintings to promote her claim to the Spanish throne, sending them across Europe and to Spain to make her visible to the people and solidify her status. This was necessary because she was a woman. Had there been a male heir to the Spanish throne living in Vienna, there would have been no need for propaganda efforts like this. But the fear of female rule ran deep, and the idea of a woman inheriting Spain's vast empire was enough to send shockwaves through Europe's courts. As Maria Antonia grew up in Vienna, she remained blissfully unaware of the political storm surrounding her. While the great powers of Europe debated her fate, she was raised like any highborn Habsburg princess, wrapped in courtly formality and surrounded by attendants catering to her every need. Her education was fitting for a royal woman of her time: Latin, French, music, and basic elements of the humanist curriculum. Those who met her described her as quiet and serious, yet intelligent and distinguished. But after her mother's death, life became even more rigid. That being said, Maria Antonia did have a quick succession of stepmothers. Within months of his wife's death, Leopold married his second cousin, Archduchess Claudia Felicitas of Austria, a member of the Tyrolese branch of the Habsburgs. Maria Antonia had a good and close relationship with her stepmother, but she too died young in 1676 of tuberculosis. Leopold then married a third wife, a German noblewoman who was also his second cousin, Eleanor Magdalene of Neuburg. She and Leopold would have 10 children, so almost every year Maria Antonia would have a new half-sibling. When a boy named Joseph was born of this third marriage in 1678, it meant that there was finally a male heir to Leopold's titles. Now Maria Antonia was only the heir to the Spanish throne, though as we have seen, the question of whether she would succeed Charles in Madrid remained problematic. Of course, there was always another possibility. Maria Antonia could produce a son of her own, a Habsburg prince, who would be the perfect male heir to claim the Spanish throne. Her father, ever the strategist, was already plotting this future while she was still just a child, knowing that a male successor could secure Spain for their bloodline once and for all. To secure the Spanish throne, Leopold made a shocking proposal. He intended to marry his 6-year-old daughter Maria Antonia to her own uncle, 13-year-old Charles II of Spain. Even in a family notorious for inbreeding, this match was surprising, not just because they were uncle and niece, but because neither was ready for marriage. Charles hadn't even reached puberty, and Maria was far too young to bear children. Despite this, in 1676, their engagement was formally announced, and a proxy wedding was planned for December. But at the last moment, it all fell apart. The following year, Charles informed Leopold that he couldn't go through with it. Spain needed an heir, and his niece was simply too young. In the end, Charles II married Marie-Louise d'Orléans in 1679, seemingly closing the door on Maria Antonia's chance to become Queen of Spain. In its place, a new plan emerged. She was to marry Victor Amadeus II, the young Duke of Savoy, who had inherited his title at just 9 years old in 1675. But this match never materialized. Instead, In 1685, Maria Antonia was wed to her second cousin, Maximilian II, Prince-Elector of Bavaria. At just 16, she left Vienna for Munich, beginning a new life with her husband. Before long, Maximilian was appointed governor of the Spanish Netherlands, and the couple spent much of their time in Brussels. In Munich and Brussels, Maria Antonia was immensely unhappy. On the surface, the marriage match was not a bad one. Maximilian was only a few years older than her, and they were distant enough relatives to somewhat lessen the Habsburg inbreeding. But there were other problems. He was a social extrovert, and she was a studious introvert who disliked court ceremonies. Maximilian often treated her with disregard, and a contemporary even referred to him as one of the most perverse minds and hearts that one can imagine. Maximilian wasted no time betraying his young wife, openly parading his mistress, while Maria Antonia endured the cold, loveless marriage she had been forced into. Yet, her greatest suffering came not from her unfaithful husband, but from her own cursed bloodline. Like so many of her tragically inbred ancestors, she struggled with pregnancy, and 2 of her sons were lost at birth in 1689 and 1690. By 1691, Maria Antonia was done. Pregnant once more, and unwilling to endure Maximilian's humiliations, she fled to Vienna, leaving behind her faithless husband. Rumours now swirled that she had no intention of returning to him. Then, in October 1692, against the odds, she gave birth to a healthy son, Joseph Ferdinand of Bavaria, the child who could change the course of European history. But Maria Antonia's battle for survival was far from over. The Spanish court erupted with joy at the birth of Joseph Ferdinand, the long-awaited heir. But this moment of triumph came at a devastating cost: his mother's life. Maria Antonia suffered from a postpartum infection, a condition that today could be easily cured with antibiotics. But in the 17th century, there was no such salvation. The body either fought off the infection or succumbed to it. As the weeks passed, her fever raged and her strength faded. By December, it was clear that she was losing the battle. Then, on Christmas Eve 1692, at just 23 years old, Maria Antonia took her final breath, leaving behind her infant son, Joseph Ferdinand, the fragile hope for Spain's future. But with the succession still uncertain, Europe's great powers were already watching and waiting. Maria Antonia's death cast wide open the issue of the Spanish succession. It was clear by then that her uncle Charles could not have children, and his health was dreadful. Contemporaries expected him to die every year throughout the 1690s, though in the end, he struggled on until late 1700. In the years following Maria Antonia's death, the Austrian Habsburgs fought fiercely to cement their claim to the Spanish throne and its vast empire. Their argument, Maria Antonia's son, young Joseph Ferdinand, was the rightful heir. After all, he wasn't just any claimant. He was the great-grandson of King Philip IV, who had ruled Spain from 1621 to 1665, making his bloodline one of the strongest ties to the fading Spanish dynasty. Most observers at the Spanish court agreed that Maria's son was the most eligible candidate to succeed Charles when he died. However, the French royal house of Bourbon also had a claim. Philip IV's daughter, Maria Theresa, had married Louis XIV, King of France, back in 1660, a marriage that led to many children and grandchildren. Of these grandchildren was a boy named Philip, the great-grandson of King Philip III of Spain, who had ruled way back at the start of the 17th century. He might have been overlooked entirely, if not for tragedy. In 1699, Maria Antonia's only surviving son, Joseph Ferdinand, died of smallpox, the deadliest disease of the era. With his death, the Austrian Habsburgs' claim to the Spanish throne crumbled, forcing them to shift their ambitions to one of Leopold's younger sons, Charles, who would soon become the new contender for Spain's vast empire. On November 1st, 1700, Charles II, the Bewitched King, died at just 38 years old. As noted, his second marriage had produced no children, and with his death, the Spanish Habsburg dynasty came to an end. On his deathbed, Charles made a fateful decision. He named the French candidate Philip as his heir, ensuring Spain would align with France. But this sparked outrage across Europe. The Austrians, backed by England and the Dutch, refused to accept this, and within months, the continent was engulfed in war. Thus, in 1701, the brutal War of Spanish Succession began, a 13-year struggle that drew in nearly every major European power. In the end, the French candidate prevailed, and Philip V took the Spanish throne. But with a catch: Spain and France were forbidden from uniting under a single crown. Meanwhile, the Austrians were compensated with Spain's vast European holdings, including Belgium, Milan, Naples and Sardinia. Had Maria Antonia or her son lived, the succession might have been far less chaotic, and history very different. Thank you so much everyone for watching this video on this line of inbred princesses and the most inbred line, or one of the most inbred lines in history. I hope you found it interesting. Let me know what you thought of the video down below in the comments, and if you want more long videos like this or on inbred topics, also let me know down below in the comments. I hope you guys are subscribed and have notifications turned on to get all my videos as soon as I upload them. Anyway, that's all from me, so I'll see all of you in the next Forgotten Life. Thanks.